The 8th Air Force lost more men dead than the entire United States Marine Corps lost in all of World War II. Sit with that for a moment, because almost no one believes it the first time they hear it. The Marines, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, every black volcanic beach in the Pacific that turned red, the Marine Corps lost just under 20,000 men killed in action across that entire war. The bomber crews flying out of the cold, flat fields of eastern England lost more than 26,000 dead. Donald Miller put the number down plainly in Masters of the Air, and then he put down the figure that should stop you cold. 77% of the American airmen who flew against Germany before D-Day became casualties. Not 77% of one bad squadron, 77% of all of them. These were not men dying on a beach with the enemy in front of them and somewhere to run. They were boys sealed inside aluminum at 25,000 feet, 4 miles up over occupied Europe, where the temperature outside the thin metal skin dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius, where the flak came up in black blossoms they had to fly straight through, and where German fighters waited at the exact point on the map where their own escorts had to turn around and go home. And here is the part that should make your jaw tighten. The men who designed the theory that killed them were not in those airplanes. They never had been. They had worked it out years earlier in a classroom in Alabama on a chalkboard, with the calm confidence of men who had reasoned their way to a beautiful conclusion. The theory had a name. The theory had a pedigree. The theory had a room full of brilliant true believers behind it, and a slogan that sounded like a law of physics. The bomber will always get through. It was wrong. And it took the best part of 2 years and a generation of young men to prove it wrong, while the people who built it defended it from behind a desk, long after the loss rates told them everything they needed to know. This is the story of that theory, where it came from, why so many intelligent men believed it, what it cost when it met the German Air Force in the skies over the Reich, and how it was finally broken, not by abandoning the idea, but by the one thing its architects had sworn was unnecessary and impossible. I want to lay the whole thing out the way you would lay out a case in a courtroom, because that is what this is. A prosecution, a defense, and a verdict. You are the jury. Let me show you the evidence. To understand how thousands of men ended up dead over German ball-bearing factories, you first have to understand how reasonable the idea sounded when it was born. Because the doctrine was not stupidity. That is the easy story, and it is the wrong one. The doctrine was the work of some of the sharpest minds the Army had, and that is exactly what makes it a tragedy instead of a farce. The slogan itself came from a politician, not a soldier. Stanley Baldwin, one of the most powerful men in Britain, stood up in the House of Commons in November of 1932 and told the nation there was no defense against the bomber. Whatever people told them, he said, the bomber would always get through, and the only defense was to kill more women and children faster than the enemy could. Here is the irony almost no one remembers. Baldwin was not promoting air power. He was frightened of it. He was arguing for disarmament, trying to scare the world into controlling aviation before it was too late. But his line escaped him. It was too good. Air power enthusiasts on both sides of the Atlantic seized it, stripped away the fear, and turned a warning into a promise. The intellectual scaffolding came from further afield. An Italian general named Giulio Douhet had argued in his book The Command of the Air that future wars would be decided by fleets of bombers smashing at enemy cities and will to fight over the heads of the armies entirely. In America, the prophet was Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, who had been influenced by Douhet, but who, and this matters, still believed bombers needed fighter support. That nuance would get lost. The men who came after Mitchell took the boldest part of his vision and quietly dropped the cautious part. Where it all came together was a quiet schoolhouse that the audience for this channel will recognize immediately, the Air Corps Tactical School. It started at Langley Field in Virginia and moved to Maxwell Field in Alabama in 1931, and inside its walls, a small group of instructors built the entire theology of American bombing. They are remembered now, half affectionately and half bitterly, as the Bomber Mafia. Harold George, Kenneth Walker, Haywood Hansel, the one they called Possum, Lawrence Cuter, Donald Wilson. These were not fools or careerists. They were the intellectual cream of the Air Corps, and they were trying to invent the future of war from first principles. Their core idea was elegant, and Donald Wilson even gave it a name, the industrial web. A modern economy, they reasoned, was not a sprawling mass you had to grind down city by city. It was a delicate machine held together by a few critical joints. Ball bearings, oil, electrical power, aircraft engines. Knock out those few vital nodes with precise strikes, and the whole enemy war machine would seize up like an engine run dry. You would not need to kill millions. You would not need to occupy the country. You would need a relatively small force of heavy bombers that could find the target, hit it precisely, and come home. And that last part, coming home, is where the fatal assumption lived. The theory held that a formation of heavy bombers, packed tightly together, each one bristling with defensive machine guns, would throw up so much overlapping fire that enemy fighters simply could not get through. The bombers would defend themselves. They called it the self-defending formation, and later the combat box. Fighter escort in this vision was a nice idea, but fundamentally unnecessary. Worse than unnecessary, actually, because the engineers told them it was impossible anyway. A single-engine fighter that could carry enough fuel to fly all the way to a target deep in Germany and back, and still dogfight when it got there, was considered an engineering fantasy. So they built their entire doctrine around not needing one. There was a dissenter. There is always a dissenter. At the tactical school in the early 1930s, the chief of the pursuit section was a leathery, hard-headed captain named Claire Chenot, a man this channel will come back to again and again. Chenot stood up in those classrooms and argued that fighters would catch up, that pursuit aviation would advance, that the bomber would not always get through. He lost the argument. He lost it to men with more rank and more institutional momentum, and he was eventually pushed out of the Army altogether. I think it is worth saying clearly, the man who turned out to be right was the man the system could not find a place for. Hold on to that, because it is the pattern underneath this entire channel. By the time the war came, the theory had hardened into doctrine, and the doctrine had hardened into something close to religious conviction. When the planners sat down in the summer of 1941 to write the blueprint for the air war, the document they produced, the Air War Plans Division Plan, was written in 9 days by 4 men who had all come straight out of that Alabama schoolhouse. Harold George, Kenneth Walker, Haywood Hansel, Lawrence Cuter. They called for a force of more than 60,000 aircraft built around daylight precision bombing of the German industrial web. And buried in their own plan was a warning that long-range escort fighters might turn out to be necessary after all. The institution read right past it. This is the part I find almost unbearable in hindsight. They wrote down the answer to the problem that would later kill thousands of their own men, and then they filed it away and forgot it. If you are finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for this one, and some of you have fathers and grandfathers who flew these missions. I want to do it justice. Now, back to the case. So that is the theory on trial. A beautiful, reasoned, institutionally beloved idea that the bomber would always get through. Now let me show you what happened when that idea was carried 4 miles above Germany and tested against a real enemy who had a vote. But before the fighters, there was the other promise, the one painted on the side of the whole campaign, precision. The American Daylight Doctrine did not just claim the bombers would survive, it claimed they would be surgically accurate, and the instrument that was supposed to deliver that miracle was the Norden bombsight. The Norden was a genuine marvel of engineering, an analog computer of spinning gyroscopes and gears that could be tied directly into the airplane's autopilot. The claims made for it were extraordinary. The company president told audiences that a 15-foot square was not a difficult target from 30,000 feet. The legend, repeated until it became fact, was that a Norden could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The secret was guarded like the crown jewels. Bombardiers swore an oath to protect it. And in the clear skies of the Arizona desert, in testing, it really could put bombs astonishingly close, within 75 feet of the aim point. The trouble was that Germany is not Arizona. Over Europe there were clouds, there was wind, there was flak knocking the airplane around and fighters trying to kill the man hunched over the site. And there was the simple fact that the bombsight that worked beautifully for one column aircraft on a test range did not work the same way for a formation of 40 airplanes dropping on the leader's signal through a freezing overcast. The historian Stephen McFarland found that the average bombing error over Europe in 1943 was around 1,200 feet, and that only about 16% of bombs fell within 1,000 feet of the target. Think about that gap. The promise was a pickle barrel. The reality was that more than 8 in 10 bombs missed by more than the length of 3 football fields. The crews were not having trouble hitting the factory. They were having trouble hitting the city the factory was in. I want to be fair here, because this audience demands fairness. The bombsight was not a fraud. In good conditions, with a trained crew, it could do remarkable things. And American daylight accuracy did genuinely exceed what the British managed at night in the early years. But the doctrine had sold a level of precision that the weather over northern Europe simply would not allow, and the men selling it knew, or should have known, the difference between a desert test range and the skies over the Reich. This is the part the recruiting film skipped. Now the fighters. The first real proof that the self-defending bomber was a fantasy came on the 17th of August, 1943. It is remembered as the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, and it was the most ambitious deep strike the 8th Air Force had yet attempted. 376 B-17s took off that morning. The plan split them into two great forces. 146 bombers under Colonel Curtis LeMay would strike the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg and then, in a bold twist, fly on across the Alps to land in North Africa. 230 more would hit the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, the very heart of the industrial web the theorists had dreamed about. Ball bearings knocked them out, the theory said, and German tanks and aircraft and engines would grind to a halt. It went wrong almost immediately. Fog over England delayed the Schweinfurt force. The two waves, which were supposed to cross the German defenses close together and split the fighter response, instead came through separated by hours. That gave the German fighter controllers a gift. They could hit the first wave, land, refuel, rearm, and come up again to hit the second. And the American escort, the P-47 Thunderbolts, simply did not have the range to go the distance. They could fight their way to the German border and not 1 mile further. The moment they peeled away and turned for home, the bombers were on their own, exactly as Chenot had warned a decade earlier, exactly as the doctrine had insisted did not matter. What happened then was slaughter. The Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s came at the formations head-on and from every angle, and the twin-engine fighters stood off and fired rockets into the tight boxes the doctrine had promised were safe. 60 bombers did not come home that day. 60. Out of 376, roughly 1 in 6, gone in a single afternoon. More than 600 men were killed, captured, or missing. The German fighter force, by contrast, lost somewhere between 25 and 27 aircraft, a fraction of what the American gunners claimed in the chaos. And the target, the precious ball-bearing plants, took real damage that the Germans largely repaired within weeks. Here is where the story should have changed. The evidence was in. The self-defending formation had been tested against a determined enemy, and it had failed, expensively. And then it got worse because the lesson was not learned. Before I get to how it was not learned, I have to take you somewhere even more brutal, because the doctrine was failing in more than one sky at once. 16 days before Schweinfurt-Regensburg, on the 1st of August, 1943, the 8th Air Force had sent a force south to attack the oil refineries at Ploesti in Romania, the wells and cracking towers that fed a huge share of the German war machine's fuel. Oil was another of those golden nodes in the industrial web. The mission was called Operation Tidal Wave, and the men who flew it came to call that day Black Sunday. 178 B-24 Liberators, with crews totaling more than 1,700 men, flew over 1,000 miles from the Libyan desert at Benghazi. And in a radical break from the whole high-altitude doctrine, they came in low, not at 25,000 feet. At rooftop height, 200 to 800 feet off the deck, to try to bomb under the defenses and hit the refineries precisely. What they flew into was a wall. The Germans had ringed Ploesti with one of the densest flak defenses in Europe, and the gunners were waiting. Navigation errors split the force, sent groups over the wrong towns, and put bombers over the target from the wrong directions at the same moment, some of them flying through the explosions and burning debris of the bombs their comrades had just dropped. 53 Liberators were lost. More than 310 men were killed, and over 100 more were captured. 5 Medals of Honor were awarded for that single mission, 3 of them to men who did not live to be given them, the most for any air action in history. And the refineries, like the ball-bearing plants, were running again within weeks, in some cases producing more than before, because they had been operating below capacity to begin with. Roger Freeman's records of the mighty 8th and Donald Miller's account in Masters of the Air agree on the shape of it. Tremendous courage, tremendous loss, and a strategic result that did not come close to matching the price. I want to pause on something, because I think it is the heart of the matter, and it is easy to miss when the numbers come this fast. At Ploesti, the crews broke the doctrine. They went in low, against everything the tactical school taught, and they were butchered. At Schweinfurt, the crews followed the doctrine to the letter, flew high in the self-defending formation, and they were butchered. The theory could not protect them when they obeyed it, and could not protect them when they abandoned it. The common thread was not altitude or tactics. It was that they had no fighters with them when it counted. And that, the one thing that actually determined whether they lived or died, was the one thing the doctrine had decided in advance they would not have. Which brings us to the day the theory finally died, even if the men who loved it would not bury it for months yet. The 14th of October, 1943. The crews would name it Black Thursday, and the name has stuck for more than 80 years. The target, unbelievably, was Schweinfurt again, the same ball-bearing plants. The 8th went back to finish what the August raid had started, and they went back having changed almost nothing that mattered. The escort still could not reach the target. The bombers would still fly the last and deepest stretch alone. 291 B-17s set out. When the curtain came off the briefing maps that morning and the crews saw the ribbon of yarn running all the way back to Schweinfurt, deep in Germany, men who had flown the first one went quiet. They knew exactly what it had cost. They knew the escorts would leave them at the border again. The P-47s fought as far as they could and then, low on fuel, waggled their wings and turned for England. And the moment they did, the German fighters fell on the formations and stayed on them, mile after mile, all the way to the target and a good part of the way home. It was the most concentrated, most ferociously defended air battle the Americans had yet flown into. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs by the hundreds. Twin-engine fighters lobbing rockets into the boxes from beyond gun range. The combat box, the doctrine's proud answer to the fighter problem, became a killing field. 60 B-17s were shot down outright. Another 17 were so badly damaged they were written off, scrapped, never to fly again, and well over 100 more came home shot full of holes with dead and wounded men aboard. Count the write-offs, and the 8th Air Force lost more than a quarter of the entire force it had sent, in one mission, in one day. The 305th Bomb Group sent 16 bombers and lost 13 of them, along with 130 of its men. The 306th lost 100 men of its own. Roger Freeman's War Diary of the Mighty 8th records October of 1943 as the single worst month for loss rate the 8th Air Force endured in the entire war. Across that month, more than 7 of every 100 B-17s sent out did not come back. And now do the arithmetic that every airman did in his bunk at night, because this is the number that truly indicts the doctrine. A crewman owed 25 missions to finish his tour and go home. At a loss rate of even 5% per mission, your odds of surviving all 25 came out to roughly 28%. Better than 1 in 4 would not make it, just from the steady, grinding math, before you accounted for the bad days like Schweinfurt that erased a quarter of a force at once. Donald Miller found that of the men assigned to the 100th Bomb Group, the outfit that earned the grim nickname the Bloody 100th, only 14% in one period made it to 25 missions. The official figures gathered after the war showed that of the men who flew the original 25-mission tour in 1942 and 1943, only about 35% survived it. A boy stepping off the train at an English airbase in the autumn of 1943 had, statistically, a worse chance of living through his tour than a Marine had wading onto a Pacific beach. That is not rhetoric. That is the math the planners had in front of them. So what did the institution do with that math? This is where, in my view, the case stops being a tragedy of circumstance and becomes something harder to forgive, because they had alternatives, and for a long time they reached for the wrong ones. The first thing they tried was not a long-range fighter. It was more bomber. If the formations needed more guns, the thinking went, then build a bomber that was nothing but guns. They took the B-17 and bolted on extra turrets and more machine guns, 14 of them and more, thousands of extra rounds, armor everywhere, and called it the YB-40. The idea was a battleship of the air that would fly along in the formation and shoot down the attacking fighters while the real bombers did the bombing. 13 of them went to England and flew their first mission at the end of May, 1943. They were a complete failure, and the reason is almost comic if it were not so grim. Loaded down with all that steel and ammunition, the YB-40 was so heavy that once the actual bombers dropped their loads and got lighter, the gunship could not keep up with the very formation it was supposed to protect. It fell behind. The German fighter general, Adolf Galland, dismissed the handful of kills they scored as insignificant. The one useful thing to come out of the whole program was the chin turret, the 2-gun turret under the nose, that became standard on the later B-17s. They had spent all that effort and arrived at a footnote. The honest truth is that the answer already existed, and the institution did not want to see it. There was an airplane that could be turned into the escort the doctrine had declared impossible, and the commander of the 8th Air Force, Major General Ira Eaker, was slow, genuinely slow, to push for it. Eaker was a believer and a brave one. He had won Churchill over to the whole daylight campaign at the Casablanca Conference in January of 1943, with a single brilliant page of argument and the line about bombing Germany around the clock. But when a proposal came up in the summer of 1943 to seriously develop a long-range escort fighter, Eaker called it premature. As late as the autumn of that year, with the loss rates screaming at him, he still believed the big formations would not really need escorts, and he gave the development of drop tanks, the cheap extra fuel tanks that would extend a fighter's reach, a low priority. I have thought about Eaker a great deal, and I do not think he was a coward or a fool. I think he was something more ordinary and more dangerous. He was a true believer, defending a doctrine he had staked his career and his identity on, and the human capacity to keep believing a thing after the evidence has turned against it is not a flaw in bad men. It is a flaw in all of us. And if you have ever watched the person who actually understands the work get overruled by people who have never done it, you already understand the air war better than the men who planned it did. The difference is that in most professions, when leadership clings to a failed idea, the cost is a wasted quarter or a bad product. Here, the cost was measured in 19-year-olds who did not come home. The fix, when it finally came from two directions at once, and it broke the deadlock in a matter of months. The first was an airplane. The second was a decision. The airplane was the P-51 Mustang. It is one of the great ironies of the war that the Mustang was originally built to a British requirement, and that the Americans almost overlooked it, because in its first form it had an engine that ran out of breath at high altitude. The transformation came when someone thought to put a British Merlin engine, the same family of engine that powered the Spitfire, into the American airframe. Suddenly, the Mustang had everything. It had a superb high-altitude engine, a clean low-drag wing, and, crucially, it could carry an enormous amount of fuel, both inside and in drop tanks slung under the wings. With those tanks, the P-51 could fly from England to Berlin and back, a round trip of roughly 1,200 miles, and still have the performance to fight the best the Luftwaffe had when it got there. The engineering impossibility the tactical school had built its doctrine around turned out to be entirely possible. It had simply taken someone willing to build it. I want to make a point here that this audience will appreciate, because most accounts get it slightly wrong. The Mustang's magic was not mainly the drop tanks. Plenty of fighters had drop tanks. The Mustang's magic was that it carried so much fuel internally and burned it so efficiently that it could go the distance and still be a thoroughbred at the far end. The P-47 and the P-38 could be stretched with tanks to reach into Germany, but the Mustang could reach all the way across it. That difference in range, a couple of 100 miles, was the difference between a bomber crew that had friends overhead at the target and a bomber crew that was alone. It was, quite literally, the difference between living and dying. The decision came from a new man. At the very start of 1944, Major General James Doolittle, the same Jimmy Doolittle who had led the famous raid on Tokyo, took over the 8th Air Force. Eaker was moved to the Mediterranean, and Doolittle, visiting his fighter headquarters, saw a sign on the wall that summed up the old doctrine in a single sentence. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters, it read, is to bring the bombers back alive. Doolittle ordered it taken down. He had it replaced with a sentence that turned the entire air war upside down. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy the German Air Force. I should tell you honestly that the story of the literal sign is disputed. No photograph of it has ever turned up, and there is evidence the change was being discussed before Doolittle ever walked in. But the decision itself is beyond dispute, and Doolittle himself called it the most important and far-reaching military decision he made in the war, and also the most controversial. What he did was cut the fighters loose. Instead of chaining them to the bombers, flying slow alongside the formations, and only reacting when attacked, he sent them ranging out ahead, hunting the German fighters in the air and strafing them on the ground, using the bomber formations as bait to draw the Luftwaffe up where the Mustangs could kill it. It was a brutal calculus, and in the short term it actually exposed individual bomber crews to more risk, which is why it was so controversial. But it was the right call, and the numbers proved it fast. In late February of 1944 came the series of massive raids on the German aircraft industry that the Americans called Big Week. The aim was no longer just to bomb factories. It was to force the Luftwaffe into a battle it could not afford. Over those few days, the Germans lost hundreds of fighters and, far more importantly, scores of irreplaceable experienced pilots. And that was the thread that finally unraveled the whole thing. Here's the strategic insight that took the Americans most of the war to fully grasp, and that the United States Strategic Bombing Survey confirmed afterward. Bombing the aircraft factories did not actually stop German fighter production. The Germans dispersed their industry, and production of fighters actually rose through 1944. What the campaign destroyed was not the machines. It was the men who flew them. The Luftwaffe could build new fighters faster than the bombers could blow them up, but it could not replace a veteran pilot in a few weeks. Between January and May of 1944, in the battle for the skies over Germany, more than 2,200 German fighter pilots were killed. Galland reported that in just 4 months he had lost 1,000 pilots. That is the bleed the Luftwaffe could not stop. By the spring of 1944, the German fighter arm that had butchered the unescorted formations over Schweinfurt was a broken instrument, and the 8th Air Force owned the sky over Western Europe. That ownership was the precondition for D-Day. The invasion of June 1944 could not have happened without it. And the loss rate, the terrible math that had made a bomber crewman's life a coin flip, fell off a cliff. The average monthly loss rate for the 8th's heavy bombers in 1943 had been about 5.1%. In 1944, it dropped to about 1.9%. Same Air Force, largely the same kind of crews, or what was left of them. The only things that had really changed were an airplane that could go the distance and one decision about what the fighters were allowed to do. Now I have to do the thing this channel always does, the thing that separates honest history from a hit job. I have to make the case for the defense, and I have to make it as strongly as its own advocates would, because the men of the bomber mafia were not villains, and the doctrine was not simply a crime. There is a real argument on the other side, and you deserve to hear it at full strength before you reach a verdict. The strongest defense is also the simplest. It worked. Whatever the cost, the American daylight bombing campaign achieved the thing that actually mattered most. It destroyed the German Air Force before the invasion. By drawing the Luftwaffe up day after day and bleeding it white, the bombers and their escorts won the air supremacy, without which the landings in Normandy would have been a massacre. Eaker himself, looking back, said the greatest thing they did was to destroy the Luftwaffe and make the sea and ground operations that followed possible. And there is a hard logic to it. You could only force the German fighters to come up and fight by sending something they had to defend against. The bombers were the bait that made the decisive air battle happen. Without the daylight campaign, the Luftwaffe might have husbanded its strength for the beaches. Instead, it spent itself over Germany, where it could be destroyed. By that reading, the bomber crews who died in 1943 did not die for nothing. They died setting a trap that the Mustang sprang in 1944. The second part of the defense concerns the technology. It is genuinely true that the long-range escort fighter the doctrine needed did not exist in usable form until late in the campaign. The Merlin-engined Mustang with its full fuel load was a 1943 and 1944 airplane. You cannot escort bombers to Berlin in 1942 with an airplane that will not be ready until 1944. So the architects of the doctrine could argue, with some fairness, that they were forced to bet on the self-defending bomber because no one on Earth had yet built the alternative. They were wrong about whether such a fighter could be built, but they were not insane to doubt it, given what existed when they were writing. And the third part of the defense is the industrial web idea itself, which was not foolish, only premature. The oil campaign in particular, when it finally came in the middle of 1944, was devastating. The Strategic Bombing Survey judged the attacks on German synthetic fuel to be among the most decisive blows of the entire war. American raids in the summer of 1944 cut German aviation fuel production to almost nothing for a time, and the German war machine spent its last year increasingly paralyzed for lack of fuel. Tanks sat still. Pilots could not be trained because there was no gasoline to train them with. The theorists who had pointed at oil as a vital node of the industrial web turned out, in the end, to be right about the target. They were simply years early, and they had badly underestimated how much force and how much air superiority it would take to hit it. So there is the defense, and it is not weak. The campaign destroyed the Luftwaffe, the escort fighter genuinely did not exist early on, and the industrial web theory was eventually vindicated against oil. A fair person has to weigh all of that. I have weighed it. Now let me give you my verdict. I think the cleanest way to judge the doctrine is the standard the historian Tammy Davis Biddle set in her book Rhetoric and Reality in Air Warfare, which is the most rigorous study of how these ideas formed and failed that I know of. Biddle argues that to call a strategy successful, it is not enough that it worked. It has to work in the way it was intended to work. And by that standard, the doctrine of unescorted daylight precision bombing failed, even though the campaign as a whole eventually succeeded. Sit with that distinction, because it is the whole case. The theory said, Bombers could fly deep into enemy territory without fighter escort and survive on their own defensive firepower. That specific claim, the load-bearing claim of the entire doctrine, was false. It was tested at Schweinfurt and at Ploesti and on Black Thursday, and it was proven false in blood. The campaign only succeeded once that central claim was abandoned, once the escort fighter the doctrine said was unnecessary became the thing that everything depended on. The doctrine did not win the air war. The correction of the doctrine won the air war. Biddle puts it precisely. The pre-war vision rested on substantially erroneous assumptions, maintained, in her phrase, largely through cognitive error and bias. And the danger was that doctrine was too often allowed to degenerate into dogma. That is the verdict, and I want to be careful with it, because it cuts two ways. The men of the tactical school were serious thinkers wrestling with genuine uncertainty, and Haywood Hansel, one of the architects, wrote later about the slumbering dread that they might be wrong, that they might persuade their leaders down a path that led to disaster. That is not the voice of a fanatic. That is the voice of a thoughtful man who was honest enough to be afraid he was mistaken. I have a great deal of respect for that. But fear in a memoir written after the war is not the same as changing course in 1943 when the loss reports were piling up on the desk. And here is the line that I think the institution never crossed in time. The evidence arrived in August at Schweinfurt-Regensburg, and the response in October was to fly the same target the same way and lose just as many. I think the real failure was not the first Schweinfurt raid. Anyone can be wrong once. The real failure was the second one, the decision to go back having changed nothing, and to keep sending crews up to die, proving a point the dead had already proven. And that points at the thing this channel exists to name. It was not one bad commander. It would be easy and false to pin this on Eaker or on any single man. The failure was systemic. The Air Corps had built an entire institution around a theory it had never tested in combat, staffed that institution with true believers, promoted the believers, taught the theory to every officer who came through, and left no one with the authority and the incentive to stand up and say the theory is killing our men, and we have to change it now. The dissenter who had said exactly that, Chenot, had been pushed out of the army a decade before. The system did not just make a mistake. It had carefully removed in advance the people most likely to catch the mistake. That is the pattern. The individual error is forgivable. The machine that made the error impossible to correct is the thing on trial. Let me put the hard numbers in one place, because when you line them up, the argument makes itself. Of the roughly 350,000 airmen who served with the 8th Air Force in England, about 26,000 were killed. That is a death rate of around 7.5%. Set that against the other American services. The Marine Corps, across the whole war, lost about 3.3% of its men killed. The Army as a whole, around 2.25%. The Navy, less than 0.5%. The men in the bombers died at more than twice the rate of the Marines and more than 15 times the rate of the sailors. From July through November of 1943, in the worst stretch, the 8th lost the equivalent of 64% of its air crew. At Schweinfurt-Regensburg, 60 bombers and 600 men in an afternoon. At Ploesti, 53 bombers and over 300 dead at rooftop height. On Black Thursday, 60 more shot down and 17 more written off, and the 8th Air Force temporarily driven out of the deep German sky altogether. More than 26,000 dead in total, more than the entire United States Marine Corps, to test and finally correct a theory that 4 men had written down in 9 days in the summer of 1941. But I do not want to leave you with only numbers, because the numbers are the easy part. The hard part is the bunks. On the bad evenings, the cost of the doctrine could be measured in beds. A barracks built for the men of a bomb group, and after a deep mission into Germany, a quarter of the bunks standing empty. Not unmade, stripped. The ground crews and the squadron clerks had a quiet, terrible routine. They would box up a missing man's belongings before the survivors got back from debriefing, so the living would not have to walk in and see his things still sitting there. His letters, his photographs, the girl back home in the frame on the footlocker. Donald Miller describes in Masters of the Air how the men on the ground learned to count the returning bombers the way you read a death notice, standing at the edge of the field as the airplanes came back in 2s and 3s when they had left in the dozens, doing the subtraction in their heads and knowing before any list was posted roughly how many friends were gone. These were not professional warriors with years behind them. They were clerks and farm boys and college students who had been civilians 18 months earlier, and now they were the smallest man on the crew folded into a ball turret on the belly of a B-17, hanging in the open air 4 miles up, where you could not even wear your parachute because there was no room. Where to get out, you had to crank the turret to exactly the right position and climb up into the fuselage and find your chute and clip it on. And you might be trying to do all of that while the airplane was on fire and falling. Many of them were 19 years old. Some were younger and had lied about it. They flew into minus 40-degree cold and flak that never let up, and fighters that came at them head-on at a closing speed of 500 miles an hour. And they did it again and again, knowing the math, knowing what a tour cost, because they had been told the bomber would always get through, and because the men who told them that were certain. I think about the gap between those two places. The classroom in Alabama, where the theory was clean and reasonable and the chalk squeaked on the board, and the inside of a burning B-17 over Schweinfurt, where the theory was being disproven one crew at a time. That gap, the distance between the men who decided and the men who paid, is the thing I cannot get out of my head, and it is the reason I made this video. So here is where the case comes to rest. The doctrine that the bomber would always get through was not a lie told by cynics. It was a beautiful idea, reasoned out by serious men, believed too deeply and defended too long, and corrected at last only after thousands of young Americans had died proving it false. The campaign they died in did, in the end, help win the war. But it won by abandoning the very thing the doctrine had insisted on, and embracing the very thing the doctrine had said was impossible. The bomber did not always get through. It got through when it had a Mustang flying alongside it, and not 1 mile before. The 26,000 dead of the 8th Air Force are the measure of how long it took the people in charge to admit that. They are also, every one of them, the reason we should be suspicious of any beautiful theory whose price is going to be paid by someone other than the people who thought it up. That's the story. The sources are in the description. If your father or grandfather flew with the 8th, in a bomb group or fighter group or on the ground crew that counted them home, I would like to hear about it. Those stories matter, so drop them in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.